Thank you for having me. I'm excited to do this talk. Michael and I had the privilege of speaking on a similar topic at SCDM a couple of months ago, so we're excited to share a little bit more of that with you guys. So there we are. So what we're going to talk about today is, kind of the concept of what is a virtual trial, the paradigm shift that we're experiencing in our industry. We're going to go through a case study of my personal experience. We're going to talk about some pros and cons that I personally found and my lessons learned, because the biggest benefit of opportunities like this is the sharing of knowledge and ideas. I was just in Michael's previous talk about adaptable, and learning from that and being able to take little nuggets away so you could go into your next study and implement some of those ideas. And that's what this industry is about. It's about learning. So you want to go for this one?
So as we think about the idea of virtual trials, decentralized clinical trials, remote studies, direct to patient, whatever you want to call them, put your own name in there. We're trying to figure out still as an industry what all this includes, but the idea of virtualization isn't new. Most of you have been using virtualization of some sort for many years, starting with EDC, but then moving on into other technologies, ePro. Maybe you're doing e-consent, you've been utilizing wearable sensors, you've been utilizing different types of technology that has been advancing in the industry. What we see is this movement over a timeline, this push towards this point where we're at today, where we say, now we have all of these tools in place, how do we effectively use them to engage patients remotely, to engage patients on a clinical trial, to make them become more familiar with the material, to help them to share their information more productively, to encourage them to be more interactive with us as researchers so that we can get the right amount of information at the right time. So this growth in the industry has come to, I think, a very interesting point for us today, where we have the ability to run completely virtual trials, hybrid type studies where patients may come to a trial site some days, but other days they're filling out information from home, but ways that we can continue to find to engage those patients in a clinical trial.
Right. And the perspectives you're going to hear today are from myself, which is small 100-patient trial, but the adaptable trial had 15,000 patients. So we wanted to give you that perspective of, it can be done in a small scale or it can be done in a large scale. So what is a virtual trial? And this is my personal definition. A virtual trial is the ability to obtain data in non-traditional methods, such as direct collection from patients and or through medical records electronically. Of course, we all have our own personal definition. I just wanted to share what my perspective of a virtual trial is. So let's talk about the paradigm shift that we've experienced as an industry in clinical data capture. Patients are helping us drive better methods of data collection. They're getting tired of going to the sites. It's not inspiring for them. It's not, within their daily lives, it's just not what they want to spend their time on. And you couple that with some outdated technology that's cumbersome to implement. And so we have to start thinking about this a little bit differently. And so one of the things is mobile technology, being able to utilize different platforms of technology to collect the data, whether it be a wearable sensor, whether it be a handheld phone, whether it be a tablet. And being able to utilize those technologies to get direct patient information is valuable, for us to move forward as an industry. So let's talk about a few trial considerations. So from my perspective of when I was looking at putting my case study together, it was important to me to know who's entering the data. So if we're doing virtual data, who's entering that data? Is it coming from the patient? So if it is, that's great. It's direct source. You can't get any more reliable than direct source, unless that is the person may be impaired cognitively. So you have to keep up with what the point of the data is and what the patient's status or health condition is. Secondly, if it's coming from a caregiver perspective, you have to realize it's a relayed source, so there might be a little bit of disconnect on the actuality of the data. And then compliance with entry. The caregiver's very busy. In our case study, the data was secondary, the patient was first. They had to take care of the patient. So sometimes we didn't get 100% compliance from that data collected. Let's next talk about virtual data challenges, missing data. So we've all, if you're a data manager or a data scientist or a programmer, you're always looking for things that are missing. So you need to think about what if the device or sensor gets broken or lost? How do you replace that so that you minimize your impact on your overall trial design? What if there's connectivity issues? I live in North Carolina. We have one about every year. It's called a hurricane. And we could be without power in several counties. So does that affect your data? Up here in the north, you're going to have major snowstorms, nor'easters. So will those things affect your data where you live? And do you have plans in place to mitigate those risks? And then a cost benefit is really important to me. So you look at your study endpoints and you have to ask yourself, is the cost, is your benefit of the product better than the cost? You know, are you getting a greater turnaround on the data than you are on the cost you're putting out? And then it's accessible in real time. That's very important to some people, not all people. Some people want to see it on a monthly basis. But if you need to see that data in real time, you know, that's a consideration for cost. And to make sure it's reliable, because that's at the end of the day, you have to have high quality data. So I wanted to highlight two things about data integration. So you can have data integrated with the EDC inherently. So you build into your casebook a place to collect this data that the data gets imported in, or you can keep it separately. I would see pros and cons to both sides. Your pro for commingling it would be your automatic data integration. So you don't have to think about it. Once it's programmed, it's done. It's always there. A con would be, what if something happens to that casebook and you need to make a modification? What happens to that data downstream? Or what happens to the source of that data if you make a change to your casebook? So the flow in might have to change. So it could be double programming changes you need to be considerate of. And then if you manage it out externally to EDC, the pro would be, sorry, I'm getting old. Application built with technology for data collection. So you might be dealing with an app that's built and designed to collect the data in a cohesive and, I wouldn't say, aesthetically pleasing perspective versus trying to fit a square peg in a round hole as far as making an EDC fit on a tablet that wasn't made for that. And then a con would be your integration. So at the end of the day, you still have to integrate the data. We have to put it together for analysis, and keeping that in mind are very important things. So let's go into my case study and the lessons I personally learned through running it was 2 studies, a phase 2 blinded study, and then an open label extension where the patients could roll into it. The patient population were 50-plus-year-old Parkinson's dementia patients. We had collectively in the 2 studies about 100 patients. 2 technologies we used were ePro, and that was a subject diary that was built within the EDC system. And then we had some ECOA data, which were sleep and activity monitors. So some considerations we made, we used EDC commercial software. And then we decided as a small CRO to select and provision the devices in-house. And I'll go through some pros and cons of that decision later. We did put the URL on the tablet, and we had apps that could pull the data off the activity monitors that we also installed on the apps. And we used 2 different tablets during the course of the study. We used a Microsoft Surface tablet and an HP Elite 2. So let's kind of go through some pros of utilizing integrated within EDC ePro data. One, you get to see the data up close and personal right then. Not always point of entry, but pretty close, within a 24-hour period, depending on how you set your integration up. Then with that, you've got the ability to download your data sets that is inclusive of that data. So if you want to do mock analyses on the fly, you have that ability. And then I guess the third big thing is creating reports. So I'm a data manager, so I like to create reports. And having the ability to pull all that data together in one spot and report on it was awesome. And then, of course, from a data quality perspective, the single source of entry and no SDV requirement because of that single source entry. However, we did experience some cons of integrating within EDC. We had a situation where integrated casebook required a lot of due diligence, and something happened that I'm going to talk to on the next slide, but it was not a positive experience. Another thing we had to consider that was a con in our study was patient and site comfortability with the new device. And I mentioned we had 2 devices because by the time we had hit the second wave of enrollment, the first device was no longer available because technology changes so fast. We did have an aging population, so we had some adherence to complete the diary in a timely manner. And I guess the way we know that we had differences is we also had another study we were running in paper parallel to these studies. And the compliance on the paper filling out of the diary was a little higher than with the electronic for this particular population. And then you have to consider the resources needed for inventory and management of your devices. So you've got patient activity trackers, you've got tablets. Do you have a secure place to store them? Is it adequate for the type of devices you're storing? So those are things to consider when you want to do this in-house versus outsourcing that. So what were my lessons learned? So database modifications. We went to make a database modification, and the funny thing, it was a very cosmetic change. We were changing some verbiage on some of the pages, but when we pushed that to production, there was something unexpected that happened. All our data was deleted from previous subjects.
You weren't using metadata.
We were not using metadata. But it's a software that we had used for 10 years almost. And that was just so foreign to us to have that happen. So we met with quality, we got a game plan, we notified the sponsor, we had a big CAPA to fill out. But from that, we learned a few things that we didn't have in place as an organization that we could tighten up our process. It was a software thing and a very unexpected software thing. Track and inventory was another challenge. We're a small CRO of 50 people, small clinical team. We decided, oh yeah, we can track and keep those devices on board. So we would get around the table in the break area and provision those devices. You know, we had a protocol to follow, so we knew exactly how to do it and which steps to follow. But being a small CRO, probably not the thing you want to do. You really want to rely on the people who are experts in that. Rely on your subject matter experts. We're data managers. We can do data really well and programming. And then the device setup I just mentioned. You know, we had a protocol, we followed it, but that took time. So whatever you were going to do that day, you had to put it on hold to do something else. And then we went in with a plan of predictive enrollment. We thought, yep, we're going to enroll this study in 6 months. We've got all the devices we're going to need. And then enrollment didn't happen. And on our 4th protocol amendment, we finally got a pickup of enrollment. But at that point, the Microsoft Surface tablet was no longer available. So we had to switch to the HP Elite, which posed some challenges for our patients because it could have been that the patient who had a Surface broke theirs or it stopped working and we had to provision them a new one. So it was again a learning curve and a retraining. And then having a site with multiple devices could be a challenge too, because again, that's a lot of retraining. And then communication. What happens if something goes wrong? You know, you need to have somebody on the ground who understands the technology, understands the devices, who can help solve those problems. The good news is we locked the studies. All of them are gone now. And they did not meet their endpoints, but we do consider them a success. Again, I've gone through what happens if something goes wrong and having tech support. One of the funny things that happened was the URL for this software changed in the middle of our study. It went from HTTP to HTTPS, and so we had to figure out a way to push that out in the field. So that posed a lot of fun. And then the tablet link, we couldn't just put a shortcut on there. It wouldn't work. We had to put the full URL on there. So it was an ugly little app or icon. And then when it rendered, because it was built to render nicely on a computer, when it rendered on the tablet, it wasn't pretty. There was a lot of scrolling up and down and side to side. So I don't feel like the patient really got a good experience on that one. So that's all my perspective. And now we're going to turn it over to Michael to go through kind of a bigger scale process.
Well, yeah, and as Stacy and I talked about this and doing this presentation, it was really to bring some viewpoints about what's happened, what are some experiences, what have we learned, but really what is the industry growth and where are we going as an industry? Your story is not so uncommon. We hear it a lot, we see it a lot in the industry where people have tried to build their own studies utilizing different technologies, and there's a learning curve along the way. You brought some great lessons learned here about the technology. We don't even do provisioning of our own devices. We use C3I because they're the experts at getting devices out to the sites out in the world. And so why not put it into the hands of those experts out there? So I think a lot of those lessons learned have been shared along the way. As we think about, let me just go back to that slide there. As we think about, we talk about virtual trials, there's a lot of language out there in the industry. I kind of alluded to it at the beginning of the session, but there are a lot of words that are floating around, whether it's decentralized clinical trials, which really aren't decentralized because you're centralizing everything, all the data into one place and coming from patients and all. Remote studies, direct to patient, site list, 21st century is a new term. Has anybody heard that one yet? It's a new one's out there, 21st century trials, right? Or insert your favorite term here, right? There's going to be new terms that come out. But as we think about it, really what we're doing is providing the power of the clinical trial to go back into the patient's hand. How are we going to enable patients to share information? And part of that is the trust, isn't it? It's making sure that, you talked about we can trust data that's coming in from those patients, but we have to identify who's on the other end of the line. So we've got to have good security systems in place, good authentication systems in place. If you were downstairs earlier, you may have heard about the golden ticket concept that we came up with for the adaptable study. We use that now on our virtual trials. If we know who that patient is, if they have a relationship with the investigator, they can be assigned out a golden ticket that they can then decide whether they want to participate in the trial. Once they do, then they can start sharing their personal information, and then we can identify them through our systems. But different ways to make sure that whoever's on the other end of that line actually is who they say they are. We've conducted virtual trials where we're inviting patients who we don't know to come to a website and go through a screening process. And as they go through the screening process, if they decide that they want to consent to join the study, first we have to identify them. So we've used tools like ideology tied into our front end of the system to verify that that patient actually is who they say they are. A series of knowledge-based questions to make sure that they are who they are. And then emphasizing to that patient, even in a site-based trial, the protection of their usernames and password is just as important in a clinical trial as it is in their banking system. Nobody's going to go out there and say, here's my banking number, here's my PIN number to the rest of the world. Why would you do that with your clinical trial information that you're sharing as well? So what we've seen, and these are some statistics from the industry, is, and I'm with you, Stacy, we need to turn this just a little bit, because I've not seen these for a while, but some of the information that's coming back from the industry and the studies that are out there is that about 23% of patients are unhappy with the site selection, with the site that they have to go to. This usually occurs because they have to travel into a study center, and oftentimes it's a 2 or 3 hour journey there and back, finding parking, going into a heavy metropolitan area, whatever it might be. But they're not happy with the study site selection. The visits are too time consuming. How many of you have had a patient who's come in, or you've heard about a patient who's come into a trial site, spent 3 hours there and back just to spend 15 minutes sharing a diary that they filled out in the parking lot while they were sitting in the parking lot, right? It's all too common. If we can give patients a way to share information remotely, we can reduce that burden on them. About $50,000 to start up a study site is an average number. So just setting up a site, if you don't need that site, you can reduce your costs on the study. One of the things we didn't talk about downstairs, I was hoping to get to, was the real cost of adaptable. When they first started looking at adaptable and they priced it out, they said to do this as a site-based study with 15,000 patients was going to cost about $115 million in order to have those 40 sites set up, in order to manage those patients, have them come in for the visits. Over $115 million. In the end, their budget was about $16 million total to run the entire study. That included the use of the software, that included all of their site preparation, all the work that they did with DCRI. So being able to reduce costs there. Seeing patient dropout. A lot of patients drop out before the study ends. Finding ways to engage those patients more effectively and be able to collect that data from them directly. And then also seeing the enrollment numbers that are out there, that 4 out of 5 sites fail to reach their enrollment goals. And sometimes that means they don't enroll a single patient, so you've set up a site for nothing. Other times it means that they had an enrollment goal to get patients in by 12 months from now, and they're out at 18 months and they still haven't reached enrollment on their study. So these are some of the challenges that we see in the industry. We've taken a little bit different approach, and Anthony shared some of that this morning as we talked about the patient platform or the patient portal and the idea behind how we collect information or how we engage the patient more directly. Stacy alluded to having different technologies that you have to do integration with, right? How do we deliver a package or deliver a solution or what we call a platform, a unified platform that allows you to gather that information real time and share it real time. So you don't have to wait 24 hours to see the information the patient put in. It's there immediately. It's already in the database because you're using the database to structure your ECOA. So as we think about the steps that a patient goes through and think about the different tools that are out there, this is a view of Medidata's patient platform that we've built as a way of collecting data from patients and engaging them on a clinical trial. We use these in our standard trials, but we also can use them in a hybrid study or a virtual trial as well. There's one piece down there called virtual trials. It's an actual product. It's the one we used for the adaptable study. It is separate from RAVE, so we're not sharing information with RAVE. It's collecting information directly. We can integrate it in there, but and that's really the trial of the future for you in 2020 as we move into this platform that was talked about in the presentation this morning. One place for patients to go to, one place for you to go to as an organization to set up your trial, to create your own virtual trial, allow patients to share information either through a web interface or through devices, their own devices, BYOD, or provisioned devices, but you decide then how you want to gather that information so that we can sidestep a lot of the challenges that you've run into as you've gone through this. So a lot of lessons learned that you guys have shared with us, others have shared with us, things we've seen ourselves, building it into this ecosystem of how do we collect data. I won't go too much into this. You already heard in the presentation this morning about our patient centricity by design approach. It's active. And when we have patients, you've got two images there. We've had a couple of workshops this year where patients come into New York City and they spend a couple of days and they just get infused into our design and our production, our development teams. So they're working with our developers, they're working with our designers, they're working with our product team to give input, give a demonstration of the product. They give immediate feedback, looking at how the product is used, and then conceptualizing, thinking, what are things that a patient would want to see? How would a patient want to interact with technology? What's the type of information that you'd like to get back as a patient? You know, as you're participating in a clinical trial, you don't just want to feel like a guinea pig, but you want to be able to share data and get data back. You want to know, why was that data taken? Why is it important? And how can it be used? So taking all of this and putting it into that platform. Some of the lessons learned that we've found over the years of working in virtual trials is that there are some barriers. The biggest barrier I think that we run into surrounds basically patient privacy and the different regulations that we run into around the world. So virtual trials, a true virtual trial has only been run in the United States and in, I think, England, and I want to say Germany, but it wasn't Germany, one other country, and Japan. And this is not just with Medidata, but this is other people sharing their information. So virtual trials are fairly new to the industry, and there are barriers that have to be broken down. We work on a regular basis with regulators. Some of you in the group are from a company that may be part of ACRO. So we're leading a working group within ACRO over in the UK to work with the MHRA right now on getting adoption for virtual trials or decentralized clinical trials. The working group is talking about a lot of these issues: electronic signatures, how do you identify a patient remotely, how do you verify that the patient is sharing the information in a timely manner, and what is that process for verifying or validating that data that comes in from the patients directly, making sure that you're collecting it correctly. The patient privacy regulations, as you have found with GDPR, there are some changes in the world out there, and I think we're going to see more and more of that around the globe, even here in the United States. Hopefully, we'll feel a little bit more strongly about sharing our personal information. We tend to, in the United States, be willing to share so much on the internet without thinking about what that means for our privacy. But as we put regulations in place for privacy, it means that there are burdens that get put on to you as a sponsor or a CRO who's running a trial, and as a vendor for supplying the technology, making sure that that data is well protected, that it honors the regulation and honors the patient, the person who's sharing it, making sure that you have the right to be forgotten. If you want your data taken out, or if you don't want to be part of that data source anymore, how do we effectively eliminate that from the records so that you're no longer remembered in the system? The remote identification I already talked about, and then industry adoption. Somebody said recently, we've got a lot of pilots out there. We've got enough pilots, we can start our own airline. It's true. We have run many pilots in both virtual trials, hybrid studies, e-consent, some of the new technologies that come out. And the industry tends to want to run a lot of pilots. Adaptable was a pilot. It was a huge pilot, but it's one that puts DCRI in a position of saying, we know it works, we know how to design it, we know how to make it work going forward, so let's do more of these studies because it's saving us money, saving us time. Yours were pilots for your organization and for your client, right? But there were things you learned from, and things now that you're able to take forward and be able to say, here's what we do differently. Right. Here are the steps that we make. But we need to get that industry adoption. There's so much interest in virtual trials. Just the fact that you're all in here today and the other meetings we've had, there's so much interest in moving this technology forward. But it takes a community of the industry to be able to move this forward and get past the regulations. So what do we see? Some of the things that we've learned from the virtual trials that we've done, we see that it provides a better patient experience. It allows patients to engage effectively when they want to, from where they want to, being able to engage from home. We have a study running right now with University of California, San Francisco, where they're doing a study with adolescents who have migraine headaches and the use of melatonin to reduce those migraine headaches. But what it means is those patients, these pediatric patients who need to participate, maybe at a soccer game, maybe at a sleepover, maybe at school, maybe at home, wherever they might be, we need to collect that information as it happens. So as they're starting their migraine, they can pull out their smartphone and collect information on their smartphone to send back into the study team to say, here's what is happening with my migraine, and here's the effect of taking melatonin to see how that differentiates. The better science, being able to collect information real time from the patient directly. The source now becomes e-source from the patient. Being able to collect more objective data than subjective data. So we're able to get from that source what the real-time information is, not sitting out there in a parking lot filling out a diary after 3 weeks or 4 weeks after the event occurred. Data that is more nuanced. You talked about the cost of data. Is the cost worthwhile? And you have to do that cost evaluation to determine, does it make sense for us to use this technology? Sometimes it doesn't. But oftentimes, we need to look at the value of that data. It's a little bit different than cost, but the value. What are we gaining from it? Are we able to reduce risk? Are we able to, whether it's compliance risk or patient risk, are we able to improve access to the data, improve the quality of the data? And all of those things are nuanced as far as how we collect data and where it comes in and how it's used. Being able to eliminate things like transcription errors and be able to reduce the risk of a 483 finding that you might have at a site-based trial. And then more efficient trials, faster and continuous data collection, cleaner data with transcription errors, and outcomes-oriented data. The adaptable study was sponsored by the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, set up by the federal government because they said, we want an organization that's going to focus on how can we improve patient centricity in clinical trials. They do all kinds of things, not just virtual trials, but they do all kinds of things to look at patient centricity and getting patients engaged in study design, collecting information from patients and getting them involved. And this is one way that we can give outcomes-oriented data directly back into the clinical trial. So what are some of the lessons that we've learned? Not every study can be 100% virtual. We actually did a little study, internal study, where we went through in 2017, I believe it was, and looked at every study that was out there in clinicaltrials.gov and said, how many of these would actually be a good model for 100% virtual? How many of you think it's more than 50%? No. More than 30%? More than 25%? About 28% of those studies could be run as completely virtual trials. But we do know that every study can have some level of virtualization, whether it is as simple as doing e-consent on the front end or introducing eCOA or ePro, wearable sensors, whatever it might be. There can be some level of virtualization. And really the key here is looking at the patient burden. How much can we reduce the patient burden on a clinical trial by introducing these technologies? Do we increase the patient burden by introducing them, or do we decrease it? Does the study design allow for a patient to share information remotely so that they don't have to travel into a clinical trial site? But if they have to travel into a clinical trial site for an observation or a sample to be taken, et cetera, then maybe it's not the best use of the technology. So doing that evaluation yourself. There's always some level of virtualization that you can add to a trial that can bring benefit or value. We've learned that hybrid studies do have a significant value and that sometimes patients just want to have that face-to-face intervention with a clinical setting. So giving the patient the choice. You know, you can come to the trial, you can come every visit, or you can come some visits, or you don't have to come for any visits, but allowing the patient to make that choice. And that was one of those things that we learned from patients sitting in our office down the street about 4 weeks ago, where we were talking about virtual trials, and they said, give us the choice. If we want to come in and see the clinician, let us come in and see the clinician. So that means that you have to balance that in some of these trials, if you're going to run it as a hybrid study, to say sometimes that cost is going to be borne by the site, sometimes that cost is going to be borne by the technology. But in either way, we're engaging the patient, allowing them to make a decision. This is just my shameless plug for Medidata. But really, platform standardization provides scalability and repeatable results. When we're able to give you one platform that you're allowed, that carries information across, when a patient consents and automatically gets an ID associated inside of Rave and transfers information into Rave and allows you to automatically set up accounts for eCOA and randomize through RTSM, those are value propositions. It's reduction of the risk of data being lost. It's the improvement of data being shared at a timely manner for you to evaluate and analyze and understand where it's going to. But some level of platform standardization. I know that not all of you are going to go out there and say, we're invested in everything that Medidata provides. You're going to have your own, your own randomization engine that you prefer to have or that you may own. You may have a e-consent on the front end that you prefer. So still having some sort of standardization that you set up in every study in your virtual trials or your hybrid studies so that you can have repeatable results is going to reduce costs for you, reduce risk, and improve the chance of success. Having a technology partner that can help think through the trial design, overcome the gaps is crucial. Whether it is your ePro vendor that you're going to and saying, here here's the struggles that we're looking at. Right. How do we get devices out to every site? How do we manage those devices? Or whether it is your database vendor, whether it's a provider that can do everything for you, but having them help you think through the trial design. Experience in virtual trials allows us to come in and look at it and say, maybe if you just tweak this a little bit in your trial design, you can eliminate these 3 visits for a patient. Right. Now you've decreased the patient burden, increased the chance that a patient is going to stay on your trial because they're more engaged in participating through these types of technologies. So being able to look at the study with that mindset and be able to say, from our experience, whether it's your technology partner or your own experience as a CRO or a vendor, or excuse me, as a sponsor, that you know how to tweak that study design in order to be more engaging with the patient. And then lastly is the patient participation in the study design. Some of you were downstairs, you heard Henry Cruz, who was a patient, who helped to design the adaptable study. We bring patients in because we want them to help us design technology that they'll use. It just makes sense, doesn't it? If they're more engaged from the front end in designing it and saying, this is what's important to us as patients, then we're going to have a higher level of success in delivering these types of technologies and solutions to collect the data that's needed. So the last thing I'll talk about here is the ACRO Decentralized Clinical Trials Working Party. And this is really something that was set up over the last 6 months. And Medidata has taken the lead. We chair the group on that. But it really is a group of industry that is participating in this. And we're working with the MHRA in England. We got their permission, said we would like to go through your clinical trial process. They have a roadmap out there. We want to take your roadmap and we want to re-engineer that roadmap with a decentralized clinical trial in mind to say, if you were approved decentralized clinical trials as a way of conducting trials within England or within the UK, what would that look like? And so we're going through and developing an end-to-end trial framework, and we're also doing a trial risk assessment to help them understand what are the areas where you're going to have risk and how do we mitigate that risk and have those concerns. No guarantee that they're going to approve decentralized clinical trials as a standard within the UK, but it's partnering with the regulators to try to make a change in the industry.